Hi everyone. I'd just like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and waters in which we live, work and travel, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. As people who search for meaning and knowledge through storytelling, we acknowledge that Indigenous people have been doing so for over 60,000 years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples in the audience today as well. So I'm really excited today to introduce you to Michaela Skovranova and Danie Sprague. This conversation is part of an event program that we've been putting on with Australian Photography Awards this year. And Michaela and Danie were both committee members on the animal category. And I'm sure they'll talk a little bit about that as the talk goes on. But their insight into the world that we live in and photographing environments and animals and the place that we live is wonderful. And Danie is a picture editor, and the conversation between these photographer and picture editor is just going to be a really fascinating one to listen to. So I'm really thrilled to hand it over to them in just a minute. I just firstly want to just thank our major sponsors that help make all this possible. Nikon Australia for supporting us so much over the years and helping us put on this event. KL and Canson Infinity, along with Photoplay Photography as well. These are the major players for us that have really supported what we're doing and our vision. And without these guys, we really couldn't do what we do. So thank you so much. Finally, we have a huge amount of other support as well, which you can find on all our printed merchandise out there. So all the other sponsors, a big thank you to you as well. But I also just want to thank PSC for having us here today. For us, it's just really important to be engaging with students who are learning and to be able to impart conversations like this and have real conversations and truthful conversations with people that are coming up in the industry. And we're not saying we want to change the industry, but we want to make sure that real conversations are happening so that we can kind of make it a better place. So I will now ask Julie Moss, the Managing Director of PSC, thank you Julie, to come up and say a few words, and then we'll hand over to Michaela and Danie.
Is it okay if I speak here, or would you need to mic?
Is it better to just stand in front? Yeah, just for the online audience.
I think I've only had one last night. Thanks so much, Harriet. And I just really want to say welcome to all of you. When we designed this campus, which is only 2 years ago or so, one of the key things was to actually make it a space that enabled us to, of course, teach classes, but also to bring the industry in as much as possible. And I know some of you have been here when we've had all these doors open. This whole area has been open. Designing our studio was the same idea, that we wanted to have a space that the industry felt it could come and hold events in. I know, Julie, we've been talking about doing one for next year. So, tonight's just so special for us to have that. It's also special because you two are here, and Tom is one of our wonderful graduates at PSC. Firstly, through our advanced diploma program. I think I've known you for quite a long time now, and then our masters. It's so lovely to have that ongoing relationship, and now Harriet. And both of you teaching here this year and teaching about the industry to our students. So that's been very special as well. So, and thank you to both of you for coming. Danie, I was thinking, we've had such a long history at PSC with the Fairfax, now at 9. Yeah. Many graduates, I love, reading the media and seeing people like Daniel Pocket, Darian Traynor, Chris Hopkins, Penny Stevens, they sort of reach right back. So it's really lovely to have you here tonight too, and you too. So thank you, everyone, and I'll hand over to you now.
Shall I start? I'm just going to start with something that's a little more personal. So Mish and I met while we were judging the Animal Category Award with this year's awards. And when I heard that Mish was a photographer that had a lot of works published in National Geographic, I kind of gasped because National Geo was one of the first visual publications that I felt I connected to as a very little girl, and my grandfather was an avid collector of them, and I remember being really wowed at the photography in that magazine, and it stayed with me. I subscribed to them for years. I was a bit of a pulp collector as well over the years, and it was one of the hardest things when I did a big purge and had to size down. One of the hardest things I gave up, but I thought someone else can enjoy them now. But I guess the point of what I'm saying is that even though, as Julie mentioned, that it's important to connect and communicate, I think the photographic image is one of the most, along with music, powerful ways of connecting and telling a story without speaking. So on that note, maybe we should have a look at your video, Mish. Why don't you tell us about how you made this film and why you portrayed this and were brave enough. I'm saying brave because end of the world, it's stating a fact. Almost. Well, I don't want it to be, but yeah, it's brave to say that because I think a lot of people skirt around, dance around and think, oh, not in my lifetime. And that's why, we have governments and countries that come together like we are at the moment and putting targets into decades that I don't even relate to. It's like, why not now? So tell us about how you made this.
Well, the project started in 2016 and I've been very lucky to be able to go to Antarctica a number of times. And it very much changed and developed over time. So of course, initially when I went there, it didn't feel like that. But the last time I got to visit was February 2020, and one of the bases in Antarctica reached 20 degrees Celsius. So you could be wearing t-shirts, and I wrote a little piece about it, so I'm just going to read that out. So the End of the World is a continuation of an ongoing project which explores the impact of climate change in Antarctica. I see climate change in a similar way to an illness that takes hold of your body. it starts suddenly unnoticed. By the time it's deeply visible, the entire ecosystem is in a cytokine storm, almost impossible to control. And this work was actually created at the same time that the bushfires were burning in Australia. So it was quite a surreal time to be away from Australia during this time. I remember feeling a lot of heartache, and a lot of the guests on the ships were coming up to us and asking what was happening. And it was, I think, the very first time it became internationally known that Australia is being consumed by climate change.
Yeah.
And that's how this project came to be. I worked with a good friend of mine, Charles, who composed the music track, and we actually used recordings of the ice
Wow.
from underwater, and there's some whale sounds in it, so it really kind of incorporates the senses that you'd experience there, but it's meant to kind of create this ominous feeling of a potential collapse.
It does.
And I have to say, something that was really visible in Antarctica at the time was you could really start to see the climate change.
Yeah.
There was waterfalls.
Yeah.
There was red snow, which was the algae growing on top of the snow from the heat. So really visible changes. And
Seeing the mountaintops as well, where the
Yes.
ice has actually melted. Is
Definitely.
confronting.
So this is an ongoing project, but I think it's one that tries to illustrate climate change in places that are hard to see. And I think in general climate change is incredibly difficult to show unless we're showing either utter devastation
Yeah.
or kind of what is the in-between, where else can we go and look at that we can connect to it as well.
Very much so. And I think too, circling back to talking about photography being an important storyteller, it's a visual representation of now, and just like some of the images that I remember seeing from the Amazon when I was a little girl, it looks like a totally different landscape now. So by documenting that and keeping record of that, it's a really powerful reminder of how our environment's changed so dramatically and continues to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of lead on. I might just jump through some of these images. So they're meant to feel.
This is unbelievable.
And the thing is, one of the reasons it is called the end of the world as well is I feel like if you don't have images from there, even when you go, you don't believe it's real. It feels so otherworldly, and you don't have the usual sounds of the civilization. So it feels like you've kind of dropped off the face of the planet, and it does feel like a bit of a dream. And it really has felt
Can you
like
just go back to that? So does everyone see what I see?
Yeah.
Yeah, like a really frightening face, actually. It's almost, to me, it was almost like the bones underneath the human, and it's skeletal, and, you know, it's really powerful, that shot, and continues to be. And the fact that that's nature, you know, that's just a natural form that you've captured at that time is wow.
And I think, you know, it had a lot to do with my headspace, which says a lot.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, it's kind of nature showing us these little signals as well. That's how I like to look at it. And with my imagery especially, I do like to leave a little bit to the imagination and kind of let the viewer come into the work and see how they feel about it.
Really powerful.
And I wanted to kind of touch on to this image. So this photograph was taken in Port Macquarie, and in end of 2019.
Okay.
And the fires were burning since July.
Yeah.
So something that I found really remarkable was, as I was kind of investigating and learning, that the fire was burning underground via the root systems.
Yeah.
And that very much, this project fed into the Antarctica world in the whole sense of kind of that disintegrating from the inside until it kind of falls apart.
Yeah.
You can see the actual temperature of the ground on the image there, 642 degrees. So this is land that's actually been completely burnt over, You'd think that you can go for a little casual walk in a little birdhouse forest, but I wouldn't recommend it because you can fall into a hole and
That's
over
intense.
600 degrees. So that was something I've never witnessed in my life, and it was quite an interesting time to be going into that region because it was just at the beginning of the bushfires. It hasn't kind of taken over the coast just yet.
Wow.
But these places who had already been burned kept on burning up over and over again, something that we haven't really seen before.
Were you, Mish, aware as well that in that previous shot, the one before this one, so I noticed the green shoots, and so to me that's quite symbolic and hopeful that there's regeneration. But now learning what has been, I mean, I guess everything makes way for something new, and it's probably not the types of plants that were actually naturally occurring there. It could be weed, it could be, do you know what the new...
I think it was actually regrowth as well from the trees, but interestingly, sometimes the fire is too hot. It actually can't, the seeds can't germinate again because it absolutely demolishes them. And that's something that has happened during that season of bushfires. And we worked with the local RFS team, and they said they've never kind of had a precedent for those kind of fires before. And something that was really interesting is as we were kind of interviewing people driving down the road, they kept on saying we have to go back and speak to the traditional owners. They know what to do. And I feel like it did, out of the devastation, it opened up really positive conversation about how we can work together.
That's good.
But I have to say, as I saw the imagery coming out, from the bushfires, and I personally felt very defeated and helpless. So I went out to kind of seek volunteers. They were helping the wildlife, and I do think Australia has this beautiful heart of
And
people.
still helping.
Absolutely. And people really rolling up their sleeves and doing their best. And I think that really came to shine throughout the bushfires and the recent floods as well.
Yeah, definitely. The repercussions, they've got longevity as well. It's not just an immediate impact. It has long-term effects on our wildlife and our natural species. So I think that also these kind of images of the koalas helped put Australia on the map with the bushfires because they're very evocative and people identify koala, I mean they're unique Australian marsupial animal, native species, and I think that really spoke to the rest of the world.
It did.
And gave us a platform to say, hey, yes, there were fires in Greece as well. Like every year there's countries all around the world that are suffering massive effects of climate change. And those fires, as you say, really lifted it to another level.
And I think this also I'd like to kind of bring in the editor conversation into this. So as this was happening, this was a very self-driven project initially. And as we were driving up the coast, I was on the phone to the editor for National Geographic pitching the story. And interestingly enough, this was at the very beginning of the fire, so it wasn't a global story at the time. It wasn't globally relevant in the same way. But what happened after is those images existed, and Time magazine ended up buying the story instead. So that's an interesting thing where you kind of have these back and forth with your editors, and I think it's really important to continue to create because you don't know where it's going to end up. And I think if you feel in your heart that you really have to do something, if you have the capacity without financially ruining yourself, then then it's definitely worth exploring, and you just never know.
On that note, I obviously work in a newsroom every day, and it's even though we're communicating with the outside world and local stories and international stories, unfortunately it can feel a little insular, and it's not that there's a disconnect, but you're working with the same group of people, we're obviously lucky to have had Kate Geraghty go to the Ukraine and document the war there, for us. But having said that, what you're talking about is so valid and relevant. And I also deal with a lot of freelance photographers. And most of those freelancers, when they pitch stories to me, are pitching stories about their local community. And I'm very much behind telling local stories because I think that keeps people connected, and it's not just reporting on the news, but it's about issues that affect people and their communities. And I had a similar story in Victorian, was this New South Wales?
Yes, it was.
So similar situation, and a photographer had pitched the idea, and she was from Malakuta, and I was like, yes, we've got to do this. The hard thing for me as a photographic editor is that it's not that nobody else, that the people don't appreciate, or my fellow editors don't appreciate the stories. It's, how do I put this? Newsprint is such limited real estate that every day I have a certain number of pages. We're dictated by advertising as to what number of news pages we have. And we obviously have sections of a paper, so we've got to have at least a couple of pages of World, and we've got to have, the front of our news book, and we need to mix that up with some, real life, news reporting and courts, and then we have sort of culture and lifestyle, and there's a real mix. So what happens is that space gets squeezed, and most of these stories that are pitched to me are visual, and I could fill 4 double-page spreads.
Absolutely.
Without any words. So for me to give that kind of work the justice and the exposure it deserves, I've got to wait until I've got enough space, and there isn't something else like an election dictating a lot of what our resources are going towards. So, and that's a whole other thing, because the election very much has direct relevance to our environment, and
Absolutely.
Yes, Julie.
Can I ask questions?
Yeah.
So I know that the real estate is quite limited in press, but isn't that where online comes on?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the online content that you're allowed to produce, is that unlimited?
Pretty much. Again, there are certain things that we do, and there are online editors that actually have pitch docs, and we know what we're going to put up. A lot of the stuff that we do a bit of reverse publishing even now, and you probably have noticed that in newsprint landscape. That was a bitter pill for me to swallow, because it made me think that focus was taken away from print product, and it has to a certain degree, but it doesn't mean that it's it's not equally as valuable. And I might be an oldie because I like to consume, I like to touch books, and I like to have I don't know, it's like an emotional, it's why photographic books, why I always buy photographic books. And I like to read a newspaper, because I'm actually the boss of what I'm reading and what I'm looking at. And I find online, and the way that online news media works, that it's trying to tell me what to read, and I still can't find what I'm trying to find often on my own website. So, that's just a personal choice. But yes.
So personal projects like niches, would you have, is there a catalogue for that kind of work, and including like the videos to be published on?
There's always, there is, and there's a really, now's the time, because over Christmas and New Year, things slow down in the general media landscape, and that's when I strike. And it's like, I've got this great pick, we've got pages to fill, and it's like, this is the sort of thing that people want to see, whether they're on holidays or not, but it's a good way to sort of sell it in. And sometimes, I could say to Mish, I love this, and I might sit on it. And there's a lot of freelancers out there that go, they're not interested, and whatever, and it's been a month or 2 months, and it, like you say, without going broke or poor, you've got to really stick at what you're doing, and just stay in touch, because I often need to get prodded because I'm swimming and treading water and trying to consume so much information all the time that often I've got to prioritise my comms, and sometimes outsiders coming in, I'll come back to that, you know. And most times I do, but it can take time sometimes, unfortunately. So yeah.
No, I actually love the online landscape because it provides a bit more freedom.
Great.
You can include written word, you can include video, you can frame things differently. A lot of my images I frame dead in the middle, so publishing traditionally, it would just be
right.
it wouldn't work. So it kind of opened up opportunities for me that way, but also for people looking to get into photojournalism. It's a nice way for editors to like taste test someone, to do an online story, and you do a one-day shoot instead of a week.
Yeah.
And they get to kind of know what you're about and how you deliver the projects. And that's how a lot of people get their foot in the door as well.
That's a really good juxtaposition, and it's made me feel like, you know, I should actually not think about it as a disposable, you know,
I guess
vortex.
It can be that as well.
It can, but we can always point back to it, and you can continue to sell it, and you can continue to expose it to many different audiences over and over and over and over and over again. And you could argue that the print product, it's the budgie, it's the bottom of the budgie cage, if people have budgies anymore, but, you know, like it's, you know, you've cleaned your mirrors with the newspaper and it's rubbish. So that's a really valid point.
I think it's a good mixture, and I think it kind of encourages people to maybe shoot stills and do a bit of video. They can use it later for exhibitions as well.
Yeah.
So encouraging people to be more multimedia artists.
Yeah.
And writing their own stories as well, and just seeing where that goes.
Very much a one-man band kind of ethic.
Definitely.
I mean, our photographers are always, can you just shoot video? We've got a video department, but it's like, that actually takes a lot more time, and when you're sending someone deploying photographers on for jobs and they're driving across town, to add that on top and to say, fire your pictures, you know, I need your pictures now. It's sort of like, I'm prioritising the photographic image. But yes, for freelancers, it's really important, and I think it is a powerful tool to get their stories told.
Definitely, and that's actually what Time Magazine ended up purchasing, was the video story and a couple of images to go with it, but it mostly was a video project in the end. Yeah, which kind of was a very big turn of events for me, but I'm really glad it did get witnessed.
Yeah.
And also in terms of just how welcoming people are when times like this, in terms of high stress, and they're letting us into very intimate moments, and I think an editor plays a really important role in this as well, because it helps to guide the photographer what to look for.
Yeah.
That's what I found really helpful with working with editors. It's a beautiful collaboration, and I think it elevates the work in many, many ways that you couldn't really achieve as a lone kind of wolf going out there.
Yeah. Well, that's true as well. I had three conferences a day, but two big ones. And interestingly, you know, most of the time is dedicated to people rebriefing their stories. And let's say out of 30 minutes, I might get 4 minutes of that oxygen to show everybody's work that we've shot that day. And without the visuals, stories enhanced, or they're not showing a different side of the story. So I guess having a photographic editor that understands and has shared the efforts that have gone into actually making a story or making a picture like this, we're batting for you, because we're going in there and selling it in with the knowledge of what it actually took or what happened on the job. And I often will share little stories from the job that's not necessarily related to the shot, but, oh, by the way, did you know that this happened while, you know, and it gives the image a bit more gravitas, and it's a way to pull other editors' attention back to the visuals, because everybody does see something different, but unless you know the full story, it will actually help decide where it gets placed as well. So yeah, it's really valuable.
And you mentioned captions.
Yeah.
Yes, which interestingly enough wasn't a requirement for the animal captions. But all we went on about is like, where are the captions?
Where's the information? Yeah.
Even though it wasn't necessary for the competition, but that's something that's really important for editors in photojournalism and in competitions, is actually providing context for the work. And that is definitely a big part of my job as a photographer. After I finish shooting, for Nat Geo, for example, you have to provide a caption for every single image, and you're not allowed to delete a single image. You have to deliver all of them.
Wow.
Even the ones that you've accidentally photographed the inside of your nostrils, which has happened to me.
Could you explain?
The nostrils?
Yeah, the nostrils.
So I was setting up a underwater, like a split shot. And I was looking into the... and it was a fisheye lens.
Wow. Did you know what creature's that?
I mean, I'm used to looking myself like that, but I don't think they've witnessed that.
That's cute.
But
so you have to hand over the whole...
That's amazing.
And I remember when I started working from that's something that got really drilled into me. I mean, it was like a threat. Like, if you delete it, we'll find out. And we'll come after you.
So does that speak about your relationship with...
No, everyone, it's based, they want to see the progress. They want to see how you got to that image. And they want to get into your mind. And that way they can help to construct the story. So it's a really close, intimate working relationship. There's a lot of trust. They do allow you to make selects and kind of say these are the ones that really speak to me, but they want to see how you've arrived at those final images that you might, those 10.
Question there. Does that change the way you photograph? Like, does that make you I can imagine that would make you more diligent and not just like shooting stuff and going, I'll figure it out later.
No.
But also, does it make you kind of adhere to them a little bit rather than...
In theory, it should. In practice, because I do wildlife, nature, and I burst shoot everything. I am unhinged when it comes to the shutter button. So I do definitely overshoot because my reflexes are not necessarily that quick, so I want to make sure that I capture those moments. So they will get sometimes I'll get 30,000 images.
Oh, wow.
That's bad. Don't do what I do. That's really bad.
So how do you capture all them? Like,
Well, this is like a week job, not like a day. So there's definitely a lot of days, but a lot of them are the same. So it's quite easy to kind of see which one's the one, and you can batch caption them as well.
Do you highlight them? Like, do you put stars on the ones that you like?
Yeah, you can put a little note.
So now you do that.
So yes, they do.
30,000 images and let's go to our top 2 stars.
Again, I definitely haven't done that for a while, and at times they do go, you make the selects. Like, it really depends on how quick the turnaround is, but generally they want the hard drives and they want all of the images. Yes.
So interesting.
I love that.
Sorry, I was going to say, are you allowed to edit your own images at all, or are you completely handed over?
Generally they do the edit,
Okay.
but they have allowed me for the underwater stuff to do my own edits because I kind of know it a little bit better in terms of how I want it to look like. And I think that also they've become a bit more open over the past few years. In the past, from my knowledge, it was always the editors editing the photographs. But now they've kind of allowed different styles in. You would have seen there's some work that's a little bit darker as well. There's more diversity. So I think, and I actually think the Me Too movement 2017 was really fundamental in changing the landscape of photojournalism as well. That's definitely, I feel like, how I got my opportunity. And I've got to kind of showcase, they were welcoming new talent, younger and women as well. And that trend has continued on, and more opportunities have opened up to lots more people now. So it has changed.
That is interesting.
But yes.
Sorry, carry on.
No, please.
I was curious to know, nowadays, in terms of print media, how much you're looking at things from the point of view of monochrome as opposed to colour.
Monochrome as opposed to colour?
Yes. I mean, obviously you can print in colour, but I mean, there must be a limit to how much you can put in colour in terms of publication. So, whereas, I mean, National Geographic were using colour.
Oh my God. I wish the newspaper looked like
And
that.
obviously online, that advantage of using colour pretty much
Yeah.
all the time as well.
Massive differences. So even online, I mean, if you've got a calibrated screen, your images are going to look different than some person with a little iPad, you know. But it's the medium itself, the type of stock that's used, actually dictates what is too dark for us. And that's happened, unfortunately, with cost cutting, and the stock has changed, and there's some beautiful photographers that their work is quite dark, and it just will end up getting printed like a black, it just gets lost. So it is something that I've been asked before. They asked me last because I get cranky. Can they file another one that's too dark? It's not going to look good. You know, it's not that they don't appreciate the image and the tones in it. It's that it's just not going to reproduce in print the way it should.
Do you get into situations where there might be an image and you might be, if you like, battling with the online photo editor in terms of who has this image?
We don't have a photo editor for online, so buck stops with me and my team. We probably need one, and only because of the pace. And, you know, you can't be all things to all people all the time, but that's kind of where I was describing the differences before, and, you know, that there's an immediacy that's expected. And I'm always sort of trying to remind people that, you know, if a shoot was happening at 2 o'clock, don't ask me for the pictures at 2:07 because, you know, give us a chance. And yes, like live news coverage, as you would know, you know, photographers can send their images from protests and very quickly. They're raw and it's what's happening there and then, and that's predominantly what I deal in and what Mish deals with. There's no working of them, but they also come through without a caption. So there's time for me to then go in and add a caption and send it to the right platform and then push it through to another in order for it to be available online. So either way, you've still got to do it. Someone's got to do it, but something will compromise as a result. Someone's time, that is, yeah.
How you doing? Excuse me. When you're talking about images coming out too dark in the print medium, is that because they're shooting low key and just the new prints come out like that? Or
No.
It's generally underexposed?
It's no. It's not an observation about their work being too dark, because there's a place for that. It's the quality of the stock of the newspaper that we are printing on.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So, and that comes down to deep dots per inch. You know, that comes down to the thickness of the stock and how much of it will bleed, and, you know, the type of printing, which is a little bit different to Nat Geo and, you know, colour magazines as well, and even our weekend magazines. Totally different.
Right.
Totally different. Yeah.
But in saying that, I've had it written in my contract not to make the images too dark.
Yeah.
So there is definitely,
Yeah.
there has to be a balance, I
There
think,
does.
for what the publication is, where it's going, is it getting printed? There's so many considerations.
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, that's the art when it all comes together and it's just the right balance.
Yeah, and it is very different. Like, even just looking at some of the work here and on Saturday, having a look at all the finalist works, like, I love seeing photographs like this, and even bigger. Bring it, you know, like, it's just, you actually have time to interact with it on a personal level, and to stand back and appreciate the tiny details and the nuances. And actually, when we judged, Mish was, where were you at the time? Singapore?
Yes.
So we were judging via Zoom, and it was all on computer screen and Zoom meet. And to see them like this, they're still the same shots that we were appreciating, but you get to see them in a whole other light, and it's really lovely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a pleasure, kind of. There's a different experience.
It is.
When it comes to looking at images in print.
It really is. And exhibitions and that sort of thing, which I don't get to go to enough, but even on Saturday, it's just, it allows me to breathe. And I'm just like, that's why I do what I do, you know. And I think we need to just keep working and doing the sort of work that you're doing and getting it out there. And that's where photo editors, people like me, can help people like Mish and you know, and you guys in having your stories told.
And also, I guess, knowing that there is publications, but that's not the only output for your work. There's so many people that self-publish, they create beautiful books.
Many.
And it's, we get to be our own storytellers, we get to be our own publishers as well. And that gives you a lot more freedom in the way that you work.
Absolutely.
Which is really beautiful. Did we want to have a look at some of the exhibition images?
Yeah, sure.
On here as well. I'll skip through. So we were going to talk about macro and...
Macro
Yes.
environments, yeah. This is one of your shots of coral reef from memory.
Yes, it is.
Was that here in Australia?
It was one of my National Geographic assignments. I guess when it comes to micro, this could be a forest.
It could.
You know, there's so many ways of looking at it, and what I find fascinating is that 50 to 80% of our oxygen comes from the ocean.
Yep.
It comes from creatures in the ocean, and I think that's something that we can kind of get lost in. I do feel like when we go underwater, it feels like as close as we'd ever get to go to space.
Are you into quantum physics as well?
I am. I don't understand it at all.
No, I don't know, but I see the parallels as well, and it's all like, whoa, it's like a mind bender, really.
This was my first Nat Geo assignment, actually. And I almost jumped overboard while I was doing it because they pulled us out of water. It was many long days of going in. This is a coral spawning event.
I was going to say, is that a spawning event?
It is.
Okay.
And basically it happens like a few days after the full moon in November, very specific time. You can't put lights on the coral, otherwise it can actually stop the spawning. So you're kind of in the dark with a little, very crappy little torch that you have to hide with your hand. And there's minimum lighting.
Like a little mag light or something.
Yeah, looking for the coral. But it was,
so that's how you...
so once the spawning started, I could put lights on it.
Okay.
But what actually happened that year, it was a split spawning event.
Right, what does that mean?
That meant that only one species of coral spawned that day.
Wow.
The acropora, I believe. And we only found one coral that was spawning, this single one. And I was running out of oxygen. I was in scuba, and I was like, I'll do the right thing. I'll tell the dive guide that we have to go back and change the tanks. But they actually ended the dive. And I was like, I got 3 shots of these, and like 30-second video. That's all I got. And I was like, I'm never going to work for National Geographic again. Oh my God. And I was like, should I jump overboard at 2 a.m. and swim over? I was going crazy because I knew, and they were like, yeah, we'll go out there again tomorrow, but I knew it was going to be over.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm done. And then the editor got the images, and she was like, I love them.
Wow.
And what's really interesting that I guess the people that are not there, they don't know the shots that you've missed.
Yeah.
They don't know, the shots that maybe they know the shots that you've stuffed up, but they are very much guided by the vision that you're delivering. And I think the photographers tend to be really harsh on themselves.
Yes.
And want to kind of do their best and deliver, but we have to also be kind of aware of our limitations and what's possible in nature. And I think that's one thing to really consider in nature documentary is things change.
Oh yeah.
And plans change, and I think there has to be that communication between the editor as well.
Yeah.
And say, look, this isn't working, maybe let's try. The previous shoot actually was from a different project, and we had really terrible visibility for most of that week. And I was going to pull the pin, and I said, "There's no point spending the money on this because we can't get the shots."
Yeah.
And then the water changed,
Wow.
and it cleared up in the last couple of days.
Wow.
So it
Is that its actual colour?
yes, it
It's
is.
like sepia.
Yeah, so I use mostly, this is not natural, this is lit with a constant light source, but I mostly shoot natural light. Mostly because I think that's what you see when you're underwater. Of course, as you start going into depth and you maybe 20 or 30 meters below, you'll lose a lot of colour. And sure, if you want to fill that in, but I think I like to give almost a direct representation of what people might experience if they were in that environment.
Yeah.
And I think people are very used to seeing very saturated images of corals.
Absolutely.
And maybe then they book a holiday, go on the Great Barrier Reef,
Yeah.
and they go, "What's this?" It's brown.
Yeah.
So it really
Very
depends.
true.
It really depends on how much light is hitting the water as well.
It does. That's really interesting.
Nish, would you describe the photo before as being a healthy ecosystem, or is this something that's illustrating climate?
No, this one is actually a healthy,
Yeah.
a healthy one. And honestly, it was hard for me to tell sometimes as well. And because they are bleached to bright white, and they can look quite beautiful as well. But then they'll start getting algae growing on them, and they'll kind of change colour. So I think it is hard to see the impacts of climate change, even in mass bleaching events, unless you really are in an area that has been very heavily impacted. And that can differ. You can go around the reef and one side will be completely bleached and the other one side will be fine. So I do think sometimes also as we're telling these stories, it can make it sound like it's all gone, it's all dead. But this story was actually from a coral transplant story. So they found corals growing in mangroves, and they found them by looking on Google Earth and looking at these kind of spots where those corals might survive, and they were in very high saline and very high temperature places where mangroves grow. And they were taking this is the first time ever it's been approved, they were able to take those corals out and transplant them onto the reef to see how they would go.
And do you get to
So that was the story.
Oh, wow.
And it's been successful, and now that project and others have come to play where they do like artificial insemination of the coral as well. But what's quite interesting is now there's coral growing in Sydney, for example.
Wow.
So it started to migrate, and there was a conversation of, do we encourage the migration so that way the coral can establish itself and perhaps help to break the big storms that are going to come eventually. So there's definitely a lot of changes in a small amount of time underwater.
What do you think would be reason to try to stop it?
None.
Okay, good.
Obviously, but the only issue is that it's replacing something.
That's right. It's kind of like your shoots earlier. Something else is coming back
And
to
there's
take
only
place.
so far south that these plants and creatures can go before we're in Antarctica.
It's so fragile.
So that is an interesting conversation, and I think it's better it's more from an illustrative purpose of saying this is what's happening as opposed to let's stop it. And I actually love that nature is so resilient and it's, a coral growing in conditions that you think there's no way it would survive, and yet it finds a way. And I think that's something to really hold out hope for.
Julie's got a question for you.
I asked too many questions. Fascinating. First of all, is this a soft coral or a hard coral?
A hard coral.
And is the top bit soft?
No, I didn't touch it, but
Is that where the spawns came
yes,
from?
yes.
So it came from this one.
So this was a different project, but you can see the little. But they actually, I actually don't
They do
know.
come from hard corals as well. Because I'd assume they would come from soft corals.
No, hard corals, yes.
Oh. And so was it unusual that you said only one type of coral?
So this
spawned?
one,
Yeah,
from my knowledge, they usually spawn all together because it gives them more of a chance. And they did. They spawned a month later, actually. So it was a really unusual event, and no one could have predicted it. And to be honest, I was lucky to even witness it because there was another ship in the area at the beginning of the project, and they had the whole team. They were shooting for IMAX 3D, so they had this huge contraption that they would put in the water. They had scouts all over the reef looking. And then they would have to put this, I don't know how many, 500 kilo thing in the water to try and film this. But they were in an area where nothing happened. So they actually missed out. And I was lucky to just find one.
Good on you.
Well done.
Well, I didn't. The team, we all were looking at all the people on the boat. But it's one of those things that you can prepare, and you can have the biggest team and the biggest budget and come back with zero.
Very true. Can we see some more of your work, Mish? Tell us about this.
So this one is taken at just off Byron Bay in a nature reserve, where the currents meet. So it's a really rich ecosystem of turtles, sharks. But I guess this one was touching on the issue of us being immersed in nature and how disconnected we've become. And I think even a lot of people might not realise how much nature is just in Port Phillip Bay, for instance. Beautiful sea life. And you kind of wanted to touch on what happens when we lose that connection.
Yeah, actually. Are you talking about connecting with your environment as far as knowing what... I mean, I know a lot of people have been speaking lately of not noticing insects like they used to.
That's actually... You know what was really interesting? When I was visiting Slovakia just recently, and I'm a very beginner drone flyer.
Yeah.
And I flew the drone in the mountains in Slovakia and came back like covered in insects.
Oh, wow.
And that's never happened in Australia.
No, well, it used to.
It used to
because
happen.
I can remember taking road trips and you'd drive for an hour and the whole front of the car would be covered in insects.
Yes.
I remember being in locust plagues. My grandfather was a farmer, you know, and all sorts of, and noticing, I mean, we've got mozzies.
Yeah, we do.
And I noticed bees and flies, and those fruit gnat things that are everywhere indoors. It's horrible little things.
Yeah.
I'm sure they've got their workers. I don't mean to discriminate, but yeah, people have. There's been talk about people not noticing larger populations of different insects,
Definitely.
and that's terrifying as well.
It is, and there's definitely been a shift in that. And I do think actually nature has been our saving grace throughout the pandemic
Oh God, yeah.
and the lockdown.
Even for 30 minutes a day. How much time do we have to get outside?
An hour? Look, I was living in Sydney, so I can't relate. I'm sorry.
Well, if you're all Melbourneians, you know exactly what I was like.
But what I love is the idea of exploring your backyard. And I was very lucky to do a Trent Park workshop in 2012.
Yeah.
And I remember he was always telling us, learn to photograph in your backyard first and then take it elsewhere. And I think this was in my backyard at the time where I lived. It was a very beautiful backyard, and it was such a formative experience to be able to create on my doorstep, to connect to nature in that way, and to get to know the environment so intimately as well.
Very interesting that you say that. Harriet, you might need to remind me on the young man. I met a young man who was a finalist on Saturday.
In the surfer?
Yes.
Jack.
That I just started chatting to, and I saw the lanyard around his neck and said, "Are you a finalist?" You know, and he's like, "Yes." I said, "How old are you?" He said, 13 or something. And so I started to talk to him. I said, what shot was yours? And he went to describe it, and I actually made a point of reading his cut, so I was relaying it back, and you know, and I said, "Where did you start to take photographs?" And he said, "Birds in my backyard." And I just thought that was beautiful. And it was, you know, with further discussion, it wasn't about that he was bird crazy, it was his immediate you know,
Yes.
environment, his backyard. So what
Yeah.
you're saying, it's very true and it's very relatable. You know, I think everyone's had those moments as a kid or even as an adult. Like I live in inner Melbourne, and when I go walking up through Parkville, I always notice the big, you know, whether it's the those succulent plants that just grow with the big red, I can't remember what they're called, like I'm thinking, they're like a bromeliad anyway, they're massive. And to see those towering like the city skyline, and then you see the city behind it, like it always, you know, captures your imagination. I think it's really important to have that physical contact with the environment, with your own environment.
And I think we saw some really beautiful submissions from the animal category
Hell yes.
that were very much taken in people's backyards, and I think I was very drawn to those moments because they're so creative. And
I want you to talk about, you were very enamored, like taken by the praying mantis, which I was too,
Yes.
but shall we show?
Yes.
Do we have that one
yes,
here?
it is here.
Um,
You coming to it? Oh, no,
There, that one.
yeah. We were having a conversation about this earlier with one of the guys. He actually, because the title is The Stick Insect Universe, but it's a praying mantis. And the nerd part of us were like, but how can it be called that? But I just, yes, even though even the leg up in the air, I just think it's such a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
It does show the character as well of the animal.
Yeah.
And photographed in a way that you don't necessarily see in more competitions where it's more about like wildlife behaviour and things like that, quite like maybe scientific specific images.
Exactly.
And I think the animal category of this year competition just showed really beautiful diversity
Really did.
and creativity as
It
well.
really, really did.
Mhm.
And for that to have such beauty and individuality as well, like I think the next one was this shot by EJ. I was very moved by this, but I also have, you know, my own personal reasons because I spent a lot of time as a child in Western Victoria, and this is a familiar, not to see the foxes. I mean, I did see plenty of foxes taking lambs, but in the dead of night, and, you know, mum pulling over and going, foxes got the lamb. And we'd stop and rescue them. But to capture a moment like this of an introduced species in a very Australian landscape, it's still sending a very similar message, isn't it? But a very different subject.
Yeah, and it really stood out.
The earlier days of the awards, an image like this would have been really controversial. Like we would have actively got a lot of hate online for like how can you show this animal when it's like Australian Photography Awards.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, and now that reaction on online is nowhere near like what it is, and the committee are obviously seeing these letters.
And that's also, you know, an important conversation, introduced species. Yeah, that is a big conversation in Australia, so why not also portray it? But we were having a lot of discussions about this image.
We were. So it's still, the conversation still happens.
And the winning image as well. And we were going back and forth.
We were.
A lot. Very drawn to this image for so many different reasons.
Yeah. And if we go back to the winning image by Luke, so this is what Mish was referring to before about, well, where's the information? Where was it taken? You know, and how did he take it? And it was literally just called Tassie Devil, wasn't it? Tasmanian
that was
Devil.
the caption.
And nothing else.
Nothing else.
No story, no...
Hanging in there was a title, and then I think it just said Tasmanian Devil.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah. So it did. I mean, the more we looked at this photograph, and it is beautiful. And the more we looked at it, the more we talked about it, and it's absolutely deserving. But all of the entries were just phenomenal, really amazing. It wasn't easy, was it?
Oh no, it wasn't.
It wasn't easy to judge.
It was very enjoyable.
And
look at such beautiful work. And I guess what was really interesting, like what I was really drawn to about this image, it almost like lacks a bit of context. But you can see, you know, it's somewhere snowy. You can assume it's Tasmania. But I think it's the look in the devil's eye. It looks a little bit exhausted.
Yeah.
And so even with the kind of the simplicity of that caption, I think you can really look at this image and get lost in it in a way.
Absolutely.
As well.
And on Saturday, I learned a bit more about
yes.
how. Yeah.
What did you learn? Tell us more.
He was there to
Yes.
claim the award, and we learned that he was on holiday with his girlfriend, and it was a very opportunistic photograph. And they were in a caravan park, and they came out, and it was snowing, and he was there, and he shot the picture,
As
basically.
simple as that, because I actually went on his Instagram and stalked
Did
the
you?
hell out of him to try and find out more. I'm like, how?
Yeah.
And there you go.
Because there was a lot of talk, wasn't there, about, well, if this was shot in a zoo,
Yes.
like how many times do you see a Tasmanian devil
Yeah.
out in the wild?
And it's a
Nice.
healthy, it's a healthy
it
one.
looks healthy, it looks
Yeah.
kind of fluffy. Is it in a zoo? Is it shot in a zoo? Does that demean the photo? If it's taken in a zoo, is it still the winning photo? So all these conversations were happening, but in the end it was, well, we think it is in the wild, but if it is in a zoo, we still think it's the winning photo.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And again, there's nothing wrong with entering images that are, but it's great to provide context. So
Yeah.
captions are so beneficial because I have to say I have judged a wildlife competition in the past. It was the National Geographic Wildlife Photographer of the Year,
Okay.
2017, and they had like the Kathy Moran, like the veterans of the natural world.
Yeah.
And because the process is a bit different, and it is photojournalism, if the images didn't have captions and they weren't providing enough context and people weren't sure that that was actually a wild animal, they got disqualified.
They do, they lose point,
So, or they lose points,
Yeah.
exactly. So it really depends, it's very competition dependent, but for anyone that is interested in entering competitions, it's great to just a little bit of information.
Yeah.
So I don't have to go on Instagram and
It doesn't need to be a full essay, but just a little bit. It
Yeah.
goes a long way.
And I think for us, we adapt things year after year in APA, and this year is the first year it's just been called the animal category, and I think that's because we want to open it up to various different layers and stories, like the fox in the field, like the Tasmanian devil. If it was shot in the zoo, doesn't matter. Not in an animal category. In a wildlife category, maybe, but in the animal category, if it's got the story there and the layers there, that's what's really kind of important. And but yes, captions as well.
I have to say, if I didn't work for a publication, I probably wouldn't care one shit about captions. But it has been drilled into me now.
Yeah, that's really
And
good.
I do think it's worthwhile doing.
I still have to correct captions every day. Spelling or grammar or...
And so we skipped over a couple of images. Is there anything you wanted to go back to?
I'm still digesting all of that. Is there anything else you wanted to go back to?
You wanted to talk about some of the techniques as well.
Yes, I'd love to know, for example, your underwater work. So with drone photography, and that's what you said that you're fairly new at that. You obviously need to have pilot's license, and working for a publication like National Geo, do you have like fixers and people that actually help facilitate, or do you do all of that on your own?
That is a really, really good question. So you do get fixes, but you have to be in a certain, I think, tier of as being established.
Yeah.
So when I did my first assignment, which was the coral, I went on like a refurbished fishing vessel that looked like it was going to fall apart any second. You get given budget. If you go over budget, they tell you that it's going to go out of your wage, and you get a letter saying this is what I'm doing, but you're very much doing your own thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I got paired up with a person on the ship who was my dive buddy.
Yeah.
So dive buddies, that's a really important collaboration as well, but you don't often get to choose.
Well, and also you need to have the qualifications to be able to scuba dive as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
So it was on a boat that was taking just guests out for the week,
Okay.
so I joined in, and so one of my the dive buddy was a guest as well.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's kind of how you can so it can go from you kind of on your own, or you've got your own buddy, to
It's like a spotter.
a spotter.
Yeah.
So I often work with experts. So a lot of the underwater work that I do, I'll go back to the humpback whale image, for instance. So
This one, yeah.
so this one is, through an organised tour. There is a guide that is in the water with us. They've got a license. So quite often in Australia and overseas, you need a specific license to be able to take people. And they are the experts at being able to navigate the animal behaviour as well. So that's what I find really helpful, that knowledge is invaluable. Because of course I know, the general knowledge, but the people that spend the most amount of time with the animal, they are the experts, and they're able to find things that I wouldn't be able to. Obviously, even find a whale in the ocean, that's quite hard too.
You were talking earlier about comparing space and underwater and the similarities. So this makes me feel like I would lose my sense of spatial awareness because of the size of these animals, and they're like the size of semi-trailer, B doubles. It's almost like when pilots don't know whether they're upside down or when they're on the horizon. Do you get moments like that?
Absolutely. It's like the first time ever, you see this whale coming up to you.
Oh my God.
And they tell you don't move, because the whale knows exactly where you are.
Wow.
To the millimetre. So we might be just these little blobs just floating around in the water, but they have such incredible spatial awareness.
Wow.
This was actually taken during a heat run, so that's a different scenario.
Okay.
So for the heat runs, it's basically a female being chased potentially by 20 males.
Oh my God.
And it's really fast. So it's like a bunch of whales with hormones just spraying, and they're not going to care that there's like a little thing in front of them.
You are very brave.
Look, but I think it's maybe oblivious, but also they're so focused on what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're very unlikely that they will hit you. They can hit you on purpose though. So if they get
out of my way.
Basically, absolutely, and then it's up to us to navigate that. But in scenarios like this, the boat actually kind of drops you right in front of them, so you just jump in and just as maybe they're turning.
And is that what happened with that?
So that's me.
That is you?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So who took this picture?
So actually a person that entered and it was a finalist
What?
in the category.
With the manta ray?
No, with the crocodile, alligator.
Oh,
with the Don. So
oh my God.
yes. So
And how close? Hang on, give me that's amazing in itself. But how close? Can you give me meters? Like, how close are you to that whale? You've been dropped in, right?
Dropped in. So this is during a heat run. So the distances don't apply in the same way. When you're approaching like a mum and a calf, you need to keep a lot of distance.
Yeah.
And it's a very kind of serene environment. You swim in very slowly. You're not allowed to actually scuba dive. You have to have a special license.
Yep.
And you're not supposed to free dive either with them, but because it's a heat run, the rules go out of the window a little bit. So these guys, and I have video footage of this exact moment, and they were kind of dancing with each other, and they were kind of twirling around each other.
Wow.
But it looks a little bit closer than I am, because that whale is probably the size of a plane.
Yeah.
So the perspective looks different. So I am not that close to them, even though it looks like I am.
It really is amazing.
Yeah. And in this one, so this was actually, we did a live underwater feed.
Yeah.
And there is an underwater drone that is live streaming, and I've got a mask that I can actually speak through.
Okay.
It wasn't very good audio quality, but you can see there's like a little, tiny little creature over there. A little, I think it's a squid. No,
Oh, yes.
and so I actually worked with a good friend of mine that has dived that location a number of times. It was
Wow.
my buddy.
Yeah.
And she went in the water beforehand, and she kind of scouted the area a little bit.
Yeah.
So when we started the live feed, she already knew where to take me to find some of these animals.
Oh my God.
So that really
Is it a little squid?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so, yes. And so those kind of collaborations are like so essential
Yeah.
for me being able to do my job. I couldn't do it without those people. They can find things, you know, their eyes are just so fine-tuned to
Yeah.
those critters because that's what they do quite often, they guide. And of course they can kind of help you navigate that environment safely as
Yeah.
well, and that's really important.
You'd be learning a lot
Yeah.
in your gig as well. wouldn't you?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and I think it's doing it safely is the most important thing, both for yourself and the animals too.
Absolutely. Actually, that was very foremost with a lot of, when we were talking about a lot of this category, Mish was bringing up, you know, about how you cannot use flash and you can't, you know, there are certain guidelines and protocols that you use without startling animals. And that came up a bit, didn't it?
It did, and I guess things to consider when we're
Yeah.
creating that image. Like,
Yeah.
is it worth flash? That little creature that uses its eyesight
Yeah.
for hunting, all those kind of things. But also in terms of to avoid injury to the animal and
Yeah.
to yourself.
Yeah.
And look, accidents happen. I've had a few collisions myself,
Yeah.
but you want to make sure that it's
Exactly.
to the minimum, especially if you're looking to work in photojournalism field.
Absolutely. And like what you were saying before about what would be, you know, a topic of conversation about having a predator in that category, this was very much topic of our conversation as well. Like, you know, there was mostly respect with a lot of the shots that we were looking at, and people very aware of the potential harm or not, you know, to get the shot. It's not anything for the shot. There is, you know, it's almost anything for the shot.
That's something we're conscious of on all the categories actually, more and more over the years is, you know, considering if there's harm that is being caused to, you know, the person, the place, or the animal. And so, again, without that context, it's a really, really hard thing to do at times. And yeah, it's the external committee is so important for that part of the process because, you know, our smaller team, we can try to make a call up to a point, but having more eyes on it is really important.
I think too that's very much like bringing this full circle about how we're interacting with our environment and the climate crisis that we're in the middle of, and we haven't touched on how plastics and disposable plastics have become the bane of so much of the natural world's existence and ours. That it is about respect and being able to cohabit in our environment without causing harm, you know, whether it's perceived or it's, I think the days of people not being aware are gone. There's no excuse for it anymore. You know, most places don't have plastic straws or that I see. They do exist still, but I think, my God, yeah, it's been a long time coming.
It has. Well, there's a ban coming in February that's going to remove all dangerous or redundant plastics, and I think plastic does have a very important role, you know, especially throughout the pandemic, the PPE, etc. But when it's being misused, it ends up, you know, in placentas now, which. And, you know, a bit of plastic can be fine, but actually plastic works as a binder, so it will track toxins into it, and then when you ingest it, it will leach into your system. And this is how the health of the ecosystem is so related to our health as well. And we can't see ourselves as a separate entity because
No.
we are so dependent on every single part of it.
Absolutely.
Do we want to touch on the Ukrainian work?
That might open a whole other Pandora's box, but
I mean, I think that's such an absolutely important and beautiful way to sort of come to the end of the conversation. We're definitely sort of at kind of time now,
Okay.
so I think if anyone's got any more questions, please. I think we would love to open up the floor. I know we've been asking as we've been going, but if anyone has any other questions, it would be really great to hear them. Julie? It's normally Tom, so it's great.
You mentioned earlier on when you were in Antarctica, you kept saying we. So I was very interested to know who you were travelling with, and in particular, when you mentioned about the sound
Yes.
of the recordings underwater. How did you do that? And was that someone else that did that, or was that
I had a
you or your
hydrophone.
we partner?
Wait, I guess so. The first time I went to Antarctica, 2016, and Olympus sponsored the trip. And that was the first part of the body of work. And I was there specifically to photograph underwater. And there was an algae bloom, and there was zero visibility. So I couldn't really bring in any underwater. I couldn't even see the end of my foot, so it's quite devastating. And so I kind of started looking at different ways of documenting that environment, so I wasn't so dependent on those underwater wildlife shots. And I started kind of doing video, and then I started working as a National Geographic expert on the National Geographic Explorer ships, and I went back there working more as a guide, and along the side of that, I was photographing and filming, and I brought a really dodgy hydrophone that I just threw into the water and just recorded some crackling noises. So really, I supplied some of the sound bites to the composer, but he also found some online, like some of the whale sounds were already available and generated from different recordings. So maybe I was referring to, I was there as part of the team, and I think even the experiences I had interacting with the people that joined the trip really shaped that body of work as well.
That sound piece was amazing. It really brought that video together.
Yes. Really, and to learn after the fact that that was actual recordings while you were there taking the pictures just gives it a whole other.
I've got this dream. There's I recorded for about 20 minutes and then another like an hour, and it was just this. It sounded like popcorn, but there was this very faint sound of a weddell seal, and I recognized it, but it was so faint. But I encourage you to go home and Google and YouTube weddell seal sleeping. And they make sounds as they dream, and the sounds they create don't sound like they're from this planet at all. They're incredible.
Wow.
It is one of the most insane.
What type of seal?
Weddell seal.
Weddell. Okay, I'm looking it
It's
up.
like, you have to look it up. It is absolutely incredible.
Wow.
And that's the thing, without having that kind of technology and things like that, like picking up on those, I think the sound makes such a big part of that experience.
Well, it's something a photograph doesn't have. It's almost like you wish you could play the sound button and the smell button.
Yes.
Scratch and sniff.
You don't want to scratch and sniff in Antarctica. It's just penguin poo. It's not good. It really isn't. But yeah, I think it does enrich the experience, and moving forward, especially with my work, I would love to create more immersive experiences for people, to be able to kind of experience those environments, those climates in more of a multi-sensory way.
That's great.
Going from that, sort of talking about multi-senses and when you are approaching and shooting video and stills and sound, what's your sort of approach to that? Because I'm trying it myself, and sometimes I like focus on photography and stuff, and it ends up.
That's what I'm talking about.
It's the same. It's exactly the same. But I think with stills, I like to kind of start off with the stills, and knowing once I start doing the video that I'll miss out on capturing those kind of key still moments, but knowing video is more like you're putting a puzzle together, so you're collecting a lot of different moments to make a piece.
Yeah.
And it is a sacrifice, so to speak, especially from a photographer point of view, but recognizing the benefit that it brings. In the end, you can also photograph stills and put a GoPro on top of a housing and do it that way as well. Obviously, the quality will differ, but there's multiple different ways to go around it. And I would do, I would lug all the things with me, and then I'd just be like, which one is it going to be? But I would say I use equipment that can very easily transform from a stills camera to a video camera. So the Olympus, it's got like an internal stabilization system as well. So a lot of those kind of floating scenes that you saw in the video, that was just from the boat as we were cruising by. And because I could handhold the camera, put an ND filter in front of the lens, cut the light, and then you've got a video camera, and then you just switch to the stills again. So something that's, the equipment also really helps. And now you've got so many amazing tools to be able to create. I actually did a campaign in Antarctica that it was shot entirely on a phone, for example. So you can create pieces of work with anything. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Definitely, but yeah, it's always an internal struggle. Yeah.
Do I get the last say? Like,
I think there was one.
There was another question. Did you?
Going back to the reefs, have you ever been to Diego Island? It's off the coast of Melbourne.
No, I haven't.
It's a really pretty place. You should check it out. The water's crystal clear, and if you go at a certain time of year, the penguins go there to migrate.
Okay.
And they go up on the shore. I went there one year and watched the penguin migration.
Amazing.
And got to see all like them laying their eggs and stuff. It was really cool.
Oh, that's so amazing. There's so much around, even like St Kilda penguins, you know, there's just so much around, so I'll definitely check that out. It's a really beautiful recommendation.
Yeah.
Tom?
Mitch, is there a book?
So, making a book about Antarctica with Top of the Press, with Madeline back there. And this is my first book with a publisher. I'm really excited about it, and it's a strange experience because we're going through my 30,000 images because I overshoot to try and combine it and kind of do a representation of what Antarctica feels like. But I think, and the topic we're exploring is how it intertwines with health as well. So there's going to be both environment and physical health as well. But that's
fascinating.
Yes, so that's a really beautiful challenge. And the way that we are approaching this book and what we discussed, we want to make it accessible. It's not going to be a hard, one of those big books that you smash on a table and it's a coffee table book.
I do love
and
those.
you need like 2 hands to pick it up. And maybe that's something for way many years forward, but at the moment I want to make something that feels really light and something that also feels a bit fragile, just like that ecosystem as well, and something that's accessible to people.
What's it called?
That doesn't actually, we thought we have a name, but I didn't tell you, Matt, we don't have a name yet.
No.
Okay, I'm going to ask it.
We want I don't think from the feedback that I got, I don't think it should be called The End of the World. Something else. We'll see. To be continued. Maybe just have no title, just blank page, we'll see.
Add it to the agenda. Next meeting.
Exactly. So it's still very much taking
That's
shape.
a good title. Add it to the agenda.
And I think it's really a beautiful experience to go from documenting it, showing it maybe as an exhibition, but having something, again, tactile in print to be able to sit with and really take it all in.
Absolutely.
It's something that I'm really looking forward to.
An important part of history.
Maybe printed on ocean plastics.
And it will just disintegrate as long as soon as you
touch it. Yeah.
Or cry on it.
Yeah.
No, I think lots of ideas to play around with, but that's what's next.
It'll be beautiful.
Well,
Well done.
thank you both so much for coming and speaking to us today. I think you're both such wonderful women and doing incredible things in your industries and showing us how you work together, as well as being just experts in your industries is just incredible. And I mean, I've learned so much from you today, and I think everyone else here has too. And like a big hand. That might be the Zoom feed, but if anyone has any questions, I'm sure they will answer a few more for anyone.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you very much.
Amazing.